Hi, I'm Julie Stasch. I'm the president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation here in Chicago. And I want to welcome you to what I can already tell is going to be a dynamic conversation amongst these gentlemen. But first, let me say that what you already know, this conference is about cities, solutions, and leadership. And what a treat to have so many mayors and top advisors and economists and journalists and corporate CEOs all here with a single purpose. And that single purpose is, what can I learn and what can I share so that all of us know more about how to make cities places where prosperity is shared and the future is secure. So, spiritual leader Bruce Katz from the Brookings Institution, I think, captured this moment in history and the essence of this gathering in these words, and I wrote them down to get them just right. He said, "In this city-driven century, the solutions to our toughest problems will increasingly come from local leaders, acting in close concert with institutional investors, global corporations, and higher levels of government." He said the rise of cities was inevitable. Centralized, hyper-specialized, one-size-fits-all approaches are fundamentally ill-suited for today's challenges. 21st century problems demand rapid, locally tailored solutions that take a holistic approach to problem solving. These are the approaches that deploy the expertise, the capacity, and the resources of the public, private, and civic sectors in collaboration. So our panel today, Livable City, Healthy World, is about leadership across these sectors and solutions that produce and sustain well-being that is equitably shared. So we have a terrific group here on the stage who are eager to share their experiences with you and to challenge each other. I've invited them to do that and to respond to your questions that you will submit through social media or online. So first of all, we have Robert Doyle, Lord Mayor of the City of Melbourne in Australia, with a deep interest and expertise in health. Next to him is Charles Montgomery from Vancouver, founder and principal of Happy City, who has examined the intersection of urban design and the emerging science of happiness. I'll want to know more about that. Michael Nutter, former mayor of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and former president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, now deeply engaged in the important What Works Cities initiative. And Fernando Straface, Secretary General of Government and Foreign Affairs of the City of Buenos Aires, and founder and former executive director of the top think tank in Argentina. And then transportation leader Jay Walder from Brooklyn, New York, now CEO of Motivate, which operates the largest bike share systems in the US and powers nearly, I can't even imagine this, 60,000 bikes across 4 continents. So let's dive right in with a question for all of you. What do we mean by well-being? And for the sake of coming away from this session with concrete examples to think about, emulate, and probe further in your own local context, what do you mean by well-being, and what is one example of where a city does it well? Let me start with you, Charles.
All right, thank you. First of all, I think it's important to note what we do not mean by well-being. So for the past couple of centuries, our nations and economies have been guided by the notion that GDP equals well-being. And we've been put into this odd situation where earthquakes, divorce, car accidents are all seen as contributors to the greater good, really, because they create more economic activity. All of us know how insane that is, unfortunately, over the last couple of decades. Real scientists have been doing work looking at the intersection between brain, body, place, and social ecosystems. So I'll give you a pretty brief definition. And by well-being, what we mean when we talk about that is we're looking at several things. We're looking at healthy life years. I think we can all understand what we mean by good physical health. We're looking at, second of all, psychological well-being. How do you feel about your life? How do you feel about your day? Third, we're looking at community resilience in every way. And finally, we're looking at issues of inclusion and equity, because if everybody isn't included in the success of your city, then you certainly haven't succeeded. And I think most people living in American cities can attribute to that failure.
So, Michael, how about an example? Well-being. You can even talk about Philadelphia.
Sure, thank you. I know about Philly. You know, this question of well-being, I start at a base. If I put my old mayor's hat back on, it really is about the physical security and the day-to-day level of safety that people feel in their lives, in their home, in their neighborhood, in their city overall. As learned from Mayor Bloomberg, you know, you can't have a great city if people don't feel safe. And so for me, well-being is about the safety and security of folks, their ability to have a decent living condition, that they are food secure, and that we're looking after our most vulnerable in our population, both our children and our more senior citizens. And so that was a lot of my focus, and we were, you know, in a bit of a rise in crime when I came into office, and by the time I left, 31% reduction in homicides in the city of Philadelphia. It's a much safer city today than it was before. We did put a few more officers on the street, but that was not the sum total of the story. We used data and analytics to figure out really what were the main sources of that activity. We had 23 police districts. We realized that 65% of our shootings and homicides were in 9 of those 23, and made a reallocation, redeployment of officers. But we also, our great police commissioner, Charles Ramsey, put more officers on the beat in communities, and community policing, critically important. You know, everyone who lives in a potentially crime-infested neighborhood is not a bad person. And so the officers have to get to know the people that they're serving, the citizens that they work for, and not be an occupying force in community. And that's how you develop those relationships and really get to know what's going on in a neighborhood. We went after illegal guns, outdoor video surveillance, text tip hotlines, the ability to do what we refer to as hotspot policing. I mean, we could tell you that it is more likely that something bad would happen on this street corner than 1-2 blocks away. That's from data, and really drilling down and using data in a way that is positive for communities, sharing constantly the results. So communication is critically important with the public, and that is one of the fundamental jobs of a mayor, is to be the head communicator, the great cheerleader for your city.
What about in Melbourne? How do you think about well-being, and what's an essential core?
Let me, in the typically Australian country way, not quite answer that, but maybe give an example that ties together what Michael and Charles have said, and I'll try to make it pretty short. Just after I became mayor, early 2009, we had a terrible fire on a Saturday. We call it Black Saturday. 173 people died in that fire. Ooh. What was not generally known was that that final day was after 10 days of temperatures over 40 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit. The final day was 47 degrees, 116. During that week, 387 people died of heat, and they were the vulnerable people that Michael was talking about, the elderly, those with compromised respiratory conditions, young people, and heat is a big killer in Australia. On the Friday before those final fires, something that I sort of rang a bell with me when I was listening to the earlier panel on security and disruption and coping with that. By the time we got to Friday, telecommunications started to fail. Lifts were failing all over the city. The power supply was threatened. Public transport was threatened. And so we very nearly got to the point of city collapse. We got through it. We got through that awful day. That was at the end of 10 years of drought. The drought broke. And as we moved into the next stage, I said to my people, what can we do about this? So they did 2 things, again, relying on data, as Michael was saying. First of all, we did a heat map of the city, from the very outer suburbs all the way in. And by the time you got to the centre of the city was 5 degrees hotter in that centre because of the heat island. The next thing we did was we did a digital map of every tree in that central part of the city, the 40 square kilometres that made up the centre. And what my arborist said was, if we plant 3,000 trees a year, every year, over the next 10 years, and we diversify the forest, we'll take the canopy in the centre of the city from 28% to 40%, and by the way, that will cool the city, the centre of the city, by 4 degrees. And so there was a solution to something that came out of crisis that will make the city ineffably more healthy and livable. By the way, if you're in Melbourne, you can look at that map of trees on our website and you can email a tree. And if you write an interesting email, the tree will email back to you. You think I'm kidding, but I'm not. And that was an example of how we took something, you know, don't waste the opportunity of a terrible crisis. And we looked at what we might do around what was a crisis and a tragedy to see what we could do about a healthier and a much more inclusive city. The same things that Charles and Michael were talking about. So I'm sorry to answer your question with an anecdote, but I hope that's helpful to illustrate the points that were being made there.
It was a terrific answer, but let me turn to Fernando now.
We at the City of Buenos Aires understand well-being as the capacity of each individual to reach his or her potential in the city. And a good government has to secure for those individuals some fundamental rights and things so the individuals can be the owners of their lives, going from education, and we in the City of Buenos Aires provide public education from the age of 4, to good public spaces. We try to make in the City of Buenos Aires of the public space the best option to be around the city. When you talk about public transport, you are not talking about infrastructure projects. You are talking about the way in which people are going to earn time to do whatever they want with that time. So it's a mix of symbolic, material things that the government has to ensure that people are going to have in order to decide about their lives. We even have, at the City of Buenos Aires, a cabinet, a sort of a special group at the cabinet that thinks about enjoyment opportunities of the city. We call it in Spanish, the Gabinete of Disfrute, because we think it's a policy, it's a responsibility of a city government to provide certain opportunities for the people to enjoy the city. That's one of the ways in which we think about well-being in the City of Buenos Aires.
But that's a natural lead-in to you, Jay.
Sure. My tendency right now to answer your question is to say ditto to everything that I've
No,
heard
but
so
add your
far.
own
But
ingredient.
But I do, as you know, most of my background is in public transportation, and I think if you think about what public transportation has allowed in our cities today, we have cities that are larger and denser and more complex than we ever imagined we were going to have before. To echo a point that was made a moment ago, that doesn't translate directly into well-being. And I think one of the questions that's actually coming out of that is how we gain urban mobility in a way that actually fits with what our values are and what we actually want to achieve. I underscore 3 of those values, and that's not to say that there aren't further. Obviously, physical health being part of it, but I would again echo this point about mental health as part of it. And then I think the third point is really about our environmental values and the way in which that fits in with what we want to achieve as well. The key, I think, is to be providing a range of options and to be thinking about the way we're designing our city with this in mind, and knowing that there are interventions, there are ways that we can do things to promote active transportation, to promote active mobility, to promote ways of getting around a city that are going to put a smile on our face. And that's actually one of the key metrics.
So, but the idea that urban design undergirds a lot of this. Charles, why don't you talk a little bit about the intersection of psychological well-being and urban design?
Well, we see this in mobility systems. I'll give you 3 examples. We see it in mobility systems. So if you ask people to self-report how their journey was, cyclists say they experience the most joy and the least fear, rage, and sadness of any other commuter. Transit
Happy to hear that, thank you.
Well, yeah, buy more of his systems. Transit users report the lowest well-being because we habitually underfund transit, and often bus riders are waiting behind single-family vehicles. So if we want to improve that experience, we need to lower the anxiety of travel on public transit. We're also finding, though, in our own experiments that public space is influencing our feelings and our social attitudes in ways that most of us don't even imagine. I was just telling the Lord Mayor outside, Melbourne has this terrific urban design strategy to boost fine-grained street edges, small shops and services. You think, oh, that's a nice aesthetic thing. Actually, we found that in those environments, people are kinder to strangers. They will walk further, so they're healthier. Their level of social trust is higher. And For me, that's very relevant coming from Vancouver, which is often voted as an even more livable city than Melbourne.
Not for 6 years, mate.
And I think we're falling because we've identified a crisis in social disconnection in Vancouver. And so we're seeing affordability and social disconnection as parallel crises. And I can talk about solutions to that next round.
Just to jump
Go
in
ahead.
for 1
Go
second,
ahead, Robert.
just 2 quick observations there, and I certainly agree with what Charles said. You know, cities are not as complex as they look. If you remember a couple of things, cities are for people. They're not for vehicles, they're not for buildings, they're not for streets, they're for people. That's the first thing. And secondly, you want to know what makes a great city? Great streets make great cities. So if you think about your streets and your street design and that fine grain, then you're going to get those downstream benefits as well.
Fernando, I know you want to jump in here.
Robert just made a point that I was going to also to make. The key is to put the people's experience at the center of your policy equations before you decide a course of action. You are not moving goods or things around the city. You have human beings moving around the city, and if you think about their experience, you will get to the right place. We are having a great discussion in Buenos Aires these days because we are increasing a lot the BRT options in the city. We have one of the longest systems of BRT in, I will say, in the world. And some of the people that think about these trends say that people get much better experiences going at the BRT because they can enjoy the city, they can have a view while they are traveling, comparing to the metro, which in terms of getting you from here to there is probably shorter and more effective. But in terms of the experience, you have a much better experience going with the BRT, and of course with the bicycle much better.
What about the bicycle?
Well, I was going to say something about that. I mean, when we think about the health of cities and think about that, one of the things we're looking for is energy, activity, a sense of presence about doing it. Right. When I spent 30 years of my life, commuting to work and being involved in public transit, I had never once ridden a bicycle to commute to work. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I started riding a bicycle when I took this job, and I realized that I was seeing the city differently, and I was engaging with the city differently. Mm-hmm. And it's the point that you're making, and I was feeling it in a different way. And I remember being out one day with my wife, and I said, we should go over here. And she looked at me and said, how would you know that? And I said, I rode by on my bicycle. It looks like a really good place. Yeah. I would never have that feeling underground, and I actually don't think I have it in the car the same way either, or even in a bus. I think cities are being challenged in so many ways today. And the ability to create movement and energy with that in a way that makes us feel good and makes us feel happy is part of what is the well-being for people and for cities.
Michael, dive in.
Yeah, this is really, I think as the conversation continues to evolve, this is really about livability, well-being and livability. Design matters, zoning matters. How streets are laid out, as Robert talked about, are you on a grid system? Are the streets all over the place? Can I bike? Can I walk? What can I see? Tree canopy. All of these issues are really about the livability of place and space. And cities are best situated to have an impact on that. We can actually do something about many of these things, and some of which would make many people's eyes glaze over, but they actually have a level of importance that often is taken for granted. So I associate well-being with livability, issues again of tree canopy and who's planting trees and are the trees responding and all that kind of stuff. But also, what are we doing about the heat index? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about food accessibility? Yeah. What about poverty? Again, these are some of the great challenges that we experience in cities, and notwithstanding, the unemployment rate is below 5 and hundreds of thousands of jobs created, the reports that come out, there are a lot of people, at least in the United States of America, who are not having that kind of great well-being and livability experience, and much of that activity takes place in cities. And we really need to stay focused in that regard.
Robert, let me ask you a question. As you think about Melbourne's population doubling in the next 15 years, what is the challenge to even sustaining the good things that you've done already as the population grows?
If there's one thing that keeps me awake at night, it's that. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has suggested that in the next 15, 20, 25 years, we'll go from 4.6 million people to 8 million people. Now, in the 1970s, we were 2 million. And I've got no doubt that today we're a more prosperous, more sustainable, more creative, more interesting, more tolerant city than we were in the 1970s. But we kind of landed there by accident. We won't be afforded that luxury in the next years. And so Michael mentioned a word before that we hadn't picked up so far, and it's part of the answer of what you said, and it's part about people. Michael talked about walking. Cities have got to be walkable places too, and they have to be enjoyable to walk. I'd be interested to see where pedestrians are on your happiness index. You know, I've looked at some of the interventions in this beautiful city. I love the flower beds around the trees that they have in this beautiful city. It makes you feel good as you walk down the street. You know, if you go outside Town Hall in Melbourne, there's a flower stand. And that flower stand, his licence means he has to open till very late at night, partly so that recalcitrant husbands can buy a peace offering on their way home at 1 a.m. in the morning, and fulfills a very useful social function.
Only in Australia.
Only in Australia, only in Melbourne. What, you don't have fun anywhere? Anyway, no. But it's a bright intervention. It makes you feel good. It makes for interactions. But that's the thing that worries me. As we get to 8 million, where are we going to put them? And we've had a most unfortunate tradition, as we've grown, of spreading at the edges like a kind of stain. You know, there are some statistics about my city that I'm not very proud of. We have a new suburb called Point Cook. It used to be an old army base. It's now quite affluent housing. But there was no thought given to public transport going in there. So they're quite affluent families. I launched a book recently which had a tiny little factoid in it which shocked me. Point Cook has the highest level of induced births in Australia. Why? Because the only way out of there is to get in your car, and it might take you an hour to get out to the highway because it's so congested, no public transport, can't walk, can't bike out of there. And then it might take you an hour to go either towards Melbourne or towards Geelong, our second city, to get to a hospital. And so pregnant patients and their doctors are making choices to induce birth because of those social conditions. Isn't that an indictment? You know, a terrible thing. And this spreading out at the edges is not good, although in Australia we have been very resistant to density. That is going to have to change. Otherwise we won't be the world's most livable city for the 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th year in a row.
So anybody weigh in on this notion of density and the ability in an increasingly dense environment to sustain and enhance livability?
Hold on, this is not the... I think you've got the wrong word. You're saying density is the challenge. In fact, dispersal is the challenge.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's not a challenge, it's a reality.
Right.
Yes.
So how do you function in that reality?
And so we're seeing, if you just skip back to 2008, who lost their homes in America? It was the people living on the edges. If you look at today, where is the growth happening in American cities? We all love to think it's happening in city cores. More growth is happening on the periphery. Flying into Chicago, it was a shock to me to see greenfields being developed into single-use, auto-dependent neighborhoods. For us, this is very scary from a well-being perspective, but also from an equity and an inclusion perspective. Number one, your children have no freedom when they live out there. Number two, increasingly in America, it's the poor who are being pushed to the edges and losing opportunities to reach jobs and whatnot. So the key is to combine your transportation investments and very careful regional growth strategies. God, this sounds boring, doesn't it? Into nodes that are connected to jobs.
Not boring, but why don't, Fernando, I can see you want to say something here.
Infrastructure is...
And I can add to that there is a very positive version of density which relates to the mix of use of a type of a polycentric city. What we have seen in the city of Buenos Aires and in some other cities in the last 40 years is that there are some places where people work and some other places 30 kilometers from there where people live. And the trend globally, and certainly in the city of Buenos Aires, is to create different places where you can enjoy, you can work, you can live. Actually, for the people that are watching this live, we are inside a museum having a conference of cities. This is a type of mix of use that we want to promote all around. And with that comes the right type of density.
So I think we have to take this discussion and say, let's look forward, not backward, about what's going on. As we look forward, we are in the midst of one of the most fundamental revolutions that's taking place in transportation. Autonomous vehicles will be the nature of the way that transportation is operating. Electric vehicles will be the nature of the way that transportation is operating. The sharing economy will be the nature of the way that transportation is operating. What is that actually saying about the pattern of what we're doing today as we think about the development that we're doing for 20, 30, 40 years out? What it's enforcing or reinforcing is the importance of bringing together land use and the transportation infrastructure investments. The only large-scale infrastructure investments, for example, in public transit, that really stack up anymore are the ones that are going to be allowing greater density to take place in a way that's going to allow that to be directly connected to the transit system. The model of this in the world is Hong Kong. And where they truly have connected the development of the public transit system and the housing and commercial centers together in a way that is far greater than anyone else has done. By the way, the percentage of public transit use as a percentage of trips in Hong Kong is greater than anywhere else in the world. It's not an accident.
Michael.
I want to key off of Jay's point, but not taking an opposing view, but raising an additional concern. So autonomous vehicles come, trucks, taxis, other modes of transport. Many of those individuals live and work in cities. They are going to lose their jobs.
Yes, it's a problem.
We're not having an honest discussion. I'm not talking about this panel, just kind of nationally, at least in the United States. With great technological change, and we want the latest, the phone, the device, the this, that, whatever, because it makes our lives easier, connects us somehow. Somehow it was supposed to, make life simpler, and somehow we're doing more work with all this technological change. But it is not only disruptive, but it also displaces. And at least here in the United States of America, we have to have an honest conversation with Americans about the future impact of this technological wave, which will be much quicker than waves that we've seen in the past. And suddenly, it'll be upon us. And I think many Americans will not be ready for that, and then they're scrambling.
I'm very scared.
I could not agree more. And the percentage, by the way, across the board in U.S. cities is 10% of our workforce is actually in the process of moving or driving vehicles of one sort or another. That's an enormous disruption in our workforce. And I could also not agree more with this is the discussion we have to be having. Mm-hmm. So as we look and think about what the next 20, 30 years are going to be, this is a tsunami force that is coming. There is no question it's on the verge of coming. We would a little while ago you'd have this conversation. People thought you were talking about Star Wars. Now they think it's isn't that already happening? Yeah. And I think that's where we are. And we as governments, as cities, as populations need to be more prepared for this. Need to be thinking more proactively about this, or we're going to feel the force in a terrible way.
Yeah. I mean, if the no free advertising, but if Amazon and others are literally going to have some device suddenly drop out of the sky, also known as a drone, deliver packages to your house, then what happens to the U.S. Postal Service, or FedEx, DHL, UPS, pick one, whichever. I mean, we want these things to happen, but we also need to understand the consequences and the dynamics on the other side of that conversation, and be honest with people about what happens with great change, great disruption, and there are consequences that go with it.
So the consequences are going to be felt deeply in cities. But we keep talking about needing to have this conversation. Who starts this conversation? Where's the locus of solutions? I mean, how do you think about it, Robert? Should you start this conversation in your city? And who would you bring to the table?
I should. I worry about what Michael said tremendously. In the next couple of years, car manufacturers will exit Australia. We're now too expensive to manufacture cars there. Now, we hope we'll always be a country that makes things, but all three in my city, Ford, GMH and Toyota, will move out of manufacturing. And we know now that about a third of that workforce won't work again. About a third of that workforce will find some sort of work in a different field, and a third will be okay. Now those people who are not going to work, they're not going to become data processors or hairdressers. I don't know what the future of work is for them, but I know that tsunami is coming, and we better start having that conversation. And thank you for reminding me of my responsibilities there. Maybe I should start that conversation, but it's a difficult one.
But you didn't answer my question.
No,
so
I'm a politician. Why would I do that?
Truer words never spoken. Round of applause for an honest guy.
You're asking me to break a noble tradition, you know. Look, and that is something, we were talking about it before out in the little cream room. You know, we generate about 10,000 new jobs a year in the centre of the city, and we do a census of land use and employment. We know what people are doing. We know they're working in health services, education, clean tech, biotech, the knowledge sector economy. That's not going to help the people that Michael was talking about and I was talking about. Is there an answer for it? I'm really not sure. You know, I wish I had some sort of magic wand, but I don't. So I think we're going to go through a period of great upheaval, and if you do have widespread unemployment of people who are not going to get meaningful work again, then, you know, the happiness, the well-being, the livability of your city starts to slip, and not incrementally.
Right.
Charles, weigh in, please, here.
That was the toughest moment in the entire conversation. I don't think it's the mandate of this panel to address the oncoming jobs crisis in American and global cities. I mean, it's going to happen, and I don't feel capable of addressing that. But I do want to switch back to the implications for cities, city life, city design, and city resilience.
Yes.
So, you know, we're finding in the work we do, it's often property developers who are leading the innovation and looking forward. For example, so when cities, you're kind of stuck with your old zoning patterns, your old regulation patterns, and the populace it's a lot of work to move them. Working with a developer, for example, British Land, we found that they know the change is coming. They know that neighborhoods need to be mixed use. And by the way, back to the autonomous vehicle question, we have Car2Go, which is basically a disposable car system in Vancouver. In my neighborhood, the cars disappear at 8 in the morning. They're gone the entire day. You can't get one. Then they arrive back at around 6 at night. So in other words, for most of the day in my neighborhood, you can't get a car share. The same issue is going to happen with autonomous vehicles if we don't ensure that more neighborhoods see a mix of uses. So the new neighborhoods need to see a mix of uses. So back to what developers are doing, we notice our colleagues at British Land are ensuring their places are more mixed use. They're redesigning their suburban shopping malls in the UK to ensure that there's various reasons to be there, to stay there, to love to stay there, but then people also live in those places. So it'll more easily adapt to the coming mobility challenges.
So how do you, Fernando, think about the notion of mixed use, and how do you make sure that it happens?
In a way that is close to what Michael was mentioning. In order to make a city more livable, it has to be also socially integrated. Because if the asymmetries of opportunities between some and the others are so big, the city is not going to have the opportunity to live in a sustainable way. It's another type of resilience that we are thinking about, not the type that is related to a natural disaster, but to a socially disintegration tendency that at the end of the day is going to make the city unlivable. And this trend does not discriminate by city income. You are witnessing this trend in some European cities with high income, but that have the same social problems comparing to some other, for example, Latin American cities in the suburbs. So in order to do that, you need to have different conversations at the same time, trying to answer your question. The private sector has to have a dialogue in terms of what is going to make the private sector more competitive in the future. The educational system has to prepare new people for that new future that we still don't know which is going to be, but we know that it's going to be different from the one that we have right now. And the government also has to have the capacity to adapt regulation, because what's going on in the world is that the private sector has the capacity to innovate in a way that is faster than the capacity of the government to adapt the regulations to those innovations. It happened with the financial markets in 2008, and it's going on right now with different mobility solutions in different cities, not to call Uber.
We've had to intervene because of that. You know, mixed use in my city is not working. If I look between 2005 and I'm just talking about the 40 square kilometres in the centre now, which is a really active part. which is a narrow ring of inner suburbs and the CBD area. Between 2005, 2010, commercial, residential, retail about on a par. 2010, 2015, commercial is down to about half of residential development because that's where the developer's profit is. If I look forward from there, residential outstrips commercial 4-1. Now that's starting to get out of kilter. That's no longer mixed use. So what we're going to have to do is intervene into that market and create special use zones where we dictate what you must do on the ground plane, for instance, to keep streets active frontages. I'm not by nature a regulator or someone who intervenes, right up until I intervene. We didn't have apartment sizes or conditions, and so I was getting dog boxes in the sky. So we've had to intervene to say, these are what you need to build. So for instance, you know, your rooms have got to be something you can fit normal furniture into. I've had developers say to me, I said, what's that in the centre of the plan? That's a flexi room. I said, what's a flexi room? He said, oh, it's about a third the size of a normal room. It doesn't have a window and it has a sliding door. I said, mate, that's a cupboard. And so when you start getting those things put in front of you, you have to actually say that is not acceptable.
Right.
We're not getting proper mixed use, and that will be a poorer outcome overall unless we do something about that. In the old days, we only built commercial towers. Now that they're residential towers, you've got to think more about tower separation, so you're not staring into someone's bathroom. And so I think we need to be more nimble. Fernando's picked up an exact point there. If you let the market get too far ahead of you, you can get results that are not going to be beneficial for the overall mix of the city, particularly around mixed use.
Yeah. Let me give you an example, actually, I think, where mixed use is happening incredibly successfully, and that's the far west side of Manhattan. What you're seeing now is that you had investments that were being made in transportation, investments that were made in public space, in particular to very, very successful parks that were opened up there, the High Line on the far west side of Manhattan along the river, to be able to do that. You've relaxed zoning rules to be able to do this differently, and you're now seeing a spatial pattern of development that is coupling residential development, commercial development, right there together in a way that people are going to be able to move around. The trips are shorter. The point about that it will be relying a lot on alternative forms of transportation, I don't think there's any doubt about that, but it will actually work pretty successfully to be able to do that. And someone said to me recently, a real estate developer said to me, if you literally look at Manhattan, it's tilting west. and that's a funny statement, because the entire time I grew up in New York, this was not an area you went to, right? This was what you avoided. Right. But it is developing in a way that is absolutely fitting the profile that you're talking about right now. And I think that bodes very well for its long-term success.
Is it developing, though, in an equitable manner? Are there opportunities, different price points for residential units? Are there the kind of amenities that appeal to a broad range of people and populations? How do you make mixed use work for mixed income?
I think that's also one of the big challenges. I mean, New York City has put a lot of effort into creating affordable housing, and so integrating affordable housing into these developments so they're not separated, you're not creating islands of doing that. I think everyone believes that there's probably more opportunity to do that. I mean, so I'm not saying that it's the end-all, be-all, but you are seeing that into these developments that are taking place right now.
Michael, your experience.
Sure. Mayor Emanuel talked about this yesterday in a different meeting that I was in. We did the same thing in Philadelphia. I'm sure it's going on in New York as well. I mean, look, folks are building buildings. They are trying to provide housing. They're trying to make money, build up their company. Nothing wrong with that. That's our system. But often there are incentives that you can either enforce through your zoning code or negotiation, that there is, in fact, an affordable housing crisis in many cities across the United States of America. And so, to build a little higher, we're going to require 10%, 20%, 25% of that housing to be affordable, whatever affordable is, by the numbers in your particular jurisdiction. Zoning codes are being rewritten, design of buildings and space, even on the public housing side. The decision many years ago, the right decision to tear down many of the high-rise towers, which were just dens of whatever, and give people, even though they happen to not as high up on the socioeconomic scale, that folks deserve a decent place to live and not be crammed on top of each other. And so I think you're seeing more and more of this kind of attempt at equity being built into the system, but there's much more to be done.
We're trying to do that too. If you, and Michael it's almost a description of what happens in Melbourne. If a developer wants to build a bit tall, I don't mind if the building is tall, as long as it's at the human scale,
right.
That it works when it hits the footpath, the sidewalk. But if you can show me that there's greater sustainability in that building, or you're providing public open space as part of the development, or a percentage of affordable housing between 15 and 20%, or you've got a building of architectural excellence, then I can give you greater height on that building. And so the yield is there for the private developer, but the outcomes that we're looking for in terms of city building are also there.
Yeah.
But let's take that back to well-being
Gotta have
for
a
a moment.
plan.
I was going to ask Charles to talk a little bit about, even as we build multifamily housing, of whether it's rental or for sale, how do you think about building trust and connections among the residents in multifamily housing?
Yeah, here's the challenge. We've just finished a year-long research project looking specifically at well-being in multifamily housing. And the bad news for all of us here is that people who live in residential towers are reporting the lowest levels of trust in neighbors, helpfulness, and well-being. Obviously, wealthier people who live in towers do better. They're reporting higher levels. But this is a big issue, and so we've found that actually the sweet spot when it comes to housing, if you're looking at creating those strong, supportive local connections that so many of us don't have anymore. The average American household size is 2.5. Single-family house is the quickest growing household in this country and in many parts of the world. We're looking at limiting clusters to 12 units. 12 units sharing a space or an entrance. So in a tower environment, how can you build those clusters into your tower environment? I don't know if you're familiar with the model called co-housing. This emerged from Denmark. We're experimenting all over Canada with it. And again, with co-housing and with the level of community involvement in building co-housing, you can get up to about 25, 30 households, and they bond really well. I know this might sound sort of kind of fluffy and huggy, but it's not. People who live in co-housing are saving up to $1,200 a month in my city on childcare alone because they're living in a supportive environment. So when this crisis, jobs crisis comes, people who live in a co-housing environment or in a supportive environment will get the support from their neighbors.
So co-housing is building a village within multifamily housing or within a geographic sort of area of the city.
That's right. Well, co-housing is a formal model
Right.
of shared space. Even if we can take lessons from co-housing and be seeding your towers with those lessons, particularly the new tower projects, it can help.
I've gone about that a slightly different way. In our Docklands, which is an urban renewal area, there are many towers there. We haven't gone down that model, but to sort of retrofit community infrastructure, I built a library there. With some community facilities and maternal and child health services, some creative spaces that were cheap for artists. We put in a couple of all-purpose courts, things that are going to bring people down out of the towers and bring them together. We built a boating hub, for goodness sake, because it sits on the old Docklands, and people use that. But areas that can bring people together to help them feel that sense of cohesion, because often we've built out the existing community infrastructure that we'd expect in our normal suburban fabric.
What are some other examples of public space that brings people together, things that have worked in cities that you're aware of?
Well, it's the reuse of public space. I mean, I think, we don't often get to start with a clean sheet of paper, right? Our cities exist. They're there. I love the work that Mayor Bloomberg did in New York with literally closing part of Broadway and say, let's turn this into a public space. Now, that's a statement in itself. What's even more fun is actually walking by there and seeing the numbers of people and the way that they're interacting in the space. And in this enormous city, people flock to this space, which frankly is in the middle of the road. Right? But they're flocking there, and they're saying they're doing it, and they're seeing and interfacing, enjoying, using the city in a different way. I think a lot of our challenge is really about how we rethink the use of space. That is going to be our challenge going forward. We've already paved the roads. We still have to rethink all the things that we've done, and we can't lock our mindset into the paradigms that were thrown in front of us in the 1950s in the post-World War II period. It is time to take off those shackles.
One of our efforts to deal with the issue of not only climate change, but also more directly stormwater management. And going back to something Robert said earlier about green space, our schools and recreation centers have these enormous, concrete and asphalt open areas, contributors to, overwhelming our stormwater system and pollution in our rivers and streams. And so we embarked on a plan, joint project between Parks and Recreation and the Water Department to create more rain gardens and green space, digging up the concrete and the asphalt, which helped with the stormwater management component of water slowly percolating into the water table. But also in many neighborhoods where there were not that many trees, where there was not a park nearby, our goal was to have 75% of our citizens have no more than a 10-minute walk to open space somewhere in their own neighborhood. And transforming these vast concrete surfaces into green space, accomplishing really both goals, dealing with severe weather events and creating a new green space all across the city was significant for a lot of our neighborhoods.
It's great if you can do it with big spaces. They're a bit limited. You obviously had a model where you could do it, but you can find quite small spaces too that are no longer needed. When I see white lines painted on a road, that's some engineer telling me we don't need that for cars. Well, turn it into green. Find little bits that you can add on. We found a roadway that was originally built to carry 60,000 vehicles, but because of a change in that part of our city down on South Bank, it meant it was carrying 12,000 vehicles a day. So we can close one whole half of that road and turn it into parkland, a linear park where it's most needed. And you just have to be alive to those little possibilities. If you can do big ones, it's better still.
Oh, yeah.
What about turning that space into a bike lane?
Yeah.
I do that too. Yeah, we do that too. Look, we try to do separated ones where we can. I was saying before, one of the things I'm very proud of is that when I became mayor, 7% of journeys in the morning peak into the city were by bicycle. Today it's a little over 18%, and we're heading for 25%. That's of percentage of journeys inbound in peak hour, and that's very important. When you create those separated lanes, you make people feel safe. And you stop doorings because you have a nice, wide path for people to get out of their cars. We can't always do that. It might be that part of it's painted green. And then you've got to do a whole lot of education about sharing our spaces between pedestrians, cyclists, public transport, motor vehicles. And taking inspiration from Mike Bloomberg and Broadway, I took a deep breath and closed our main street, Swanson Street, to private vehicles. I didn't know how it was going to go. Mike assured me with the data that it would be fine, and you know how fixated Michael is on data. Today, the shopkeepers thought I was going to ruin them. Today, rentals have gone up by 30% because of the footfall that's in the street, and that street is now busier than Regent Street in London for pedestrianisation.
Yeah. And this idea about sharing the road, I think is really critically important. I would often, have to, whatever the, auto part of the public is, this street is not only for you. I got cars, I got trucks, I got bikes, I've got joggers. I mean, we literally had a campaign called Share the Road. This is not just for cars. How you time your lights, the engineers always want to time lights to give maximum time to the vehicles. We had to change some of that mindset in that process. We wanted a little more time for the pedestrians. You get some of your wide streets, I've got a man or a woman with a carriage and a kid, and they're dashing across just to get to the middle of, an island so they don't get run over. Well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, right? So, and as engineers used to remind me, if you take time from here to give to there, you can't create time, right? So you've got to, if it's 24 seconds, 60 seconds, whatever it is, but how are we sharing better that time, again, for this livability and enjoyable experience of the city? You have to share this environment.
Where are they doing it well?
Well, here's one. Let me pick 2 points on that. I'll give you an example. One point you're saying is that it is actually our responsibility as policymakers to make explicit decisions.
Absolutely.
We ceded that to the engineers.
Yeah, no.
And we have to take that back because the question about the use of road space and the way it's going to be used is a policy decision.
Right.
Right? And then we can maximize that in different ways, but we must take it back back for an explicit policy decision. Second thing to pick up on something that Robert said, he makes a great argument for bike lanes as an anecdotal argument, but it's more than an anecdotal argument. If we go back to the question of health, and if we take traditional health, the creation of bike lanes is one of the most effective ways to be able to add quality adjusted life years, and the most cost effective ways to be able to do that. And then let's step back for a second and think about, you know, our society and our cities today. Our biggest public health issues are no longer infectious diseases. Our biggest public health issues are heart attacks and strokes and diabetes and cancer, and active living is a big part of being able to deal with it. Is it the only thing? Absolutely not, but it's a big part of being able to deal with that. You know, I spent a lot of time working in London about 15 years ago, and one of the things that I was struck about was the fact that the European cities were so far ahead of where the American cities were in being able to start to think about the use of road space, the use of public infrastructure, and do it. I mean, London set up the congestion pricing system literally 15 years ago. At the same time, it embarked on ways to ensure that buses move much more effectively. So toward the point you're making, creation of the London cycle network as a means of lanes to be able to do that. And I think one of the other things that it reminds you about these things is that it takes a certain degree of stamina. It doesn't happen overnight. You create it and it takes some time and people come with it. And we have to have that stamina to be able to say, we're taking policy decisions, we're going to stick with it, we're going to drive them forward, and we're going to keep doing it.
Although on congestion pricing, when I first ran for election in 2007, one of the other candidates proposed the London model, and Philadelphians at least went crazy with just the mere, what do you mean I have to pay more money to drive my car? You know, I pay my taxes, et cetera, all those arguments. So in many, many ways, did I just see a Philly bike up on the?
Yes, you did.
Did it? Bike share? Okay. Love that. Thank you, whoever.
I just want to acknowledge, we've been talking about inclusion in public space and in streets. So your panelists are all men here, and it has typically been men who have been making decisions about mobility systems and public space for decades now. I met a remarkable woman in Vienna, Eva Kahl. If you don't know her, Google her. She pioneered something in Vienna called gender mainstreaming in planning. And
Say that again?
Gender mainstreaming in planning. I know it sounds like an arcane academic term. Basically what it came down to was this. They led bands of old ladies around the city of Vienna to see how it was for them moving around. And they transformed their spaces, first for those old ladies, because then they work better for everyone. Then they realized, oh, girls aren't using parks. Why? Because parks are designed in such a way that boys can totally take them over, and girls stop using them at about 10 years old. So by bringing women in, more deeply, and I'm talking about citizens, into the planning process, it completely transformed the way public space is designed in that city now. So I know I'm a guy saying this, doing mansplaining to an audience. However, let's open it up. Thank you.
I did pick that up. Yeah.
Oh, we're all doing it.
Yeah.
You can do the same.
We are for
you can
men.
do the same for kids, you know.
You see, you
It's
notice
that
I'm
8
not
to
here
80.
with the substantive expertise.
No, we are for
I'm
men.
just here as the moderator. So
But the same thing you can do with older people for their mobility. Do it with young kids as well. Your city should be navigable, and the general phrase is 8 to 80. You might need a bit of help before then and a bit of help after then, but your city should be navigable for that age cohort.
So in just a moment or two, we're going to start responding some of the questions that are coming in over Twitter and social media. So if you've got a question, now's the time to pose it. So let's just, little final comments here before we open it up. Fernando, why don't we start with you?
We are just 4 men speaking about livable cities, but Julia is the one leading who says about what. So, a couple of examples of making the city more people-oriented. We, in Buenos Aires, made the whole downtown of Buenos Aires pedestrian. That was a huge decision, and it worked really well. We created protected bike lines, not only paint, but also physically protected. Yeah. So now we are having a new source of congestion among bikers, which is the right type of problem, the one that you really want to have. We commit the government to create 110 new hectares of public space, green public space, and we make a public commitment, and we have to honor that. And also we are transforming one of the biggest highways of Buenos Aires into a park. We are moving the highway so we don't have to move the people, and we will transform the original highway into a park that is going to be enjoyed by people from new neighborhoods and people that are coming into the city every day.
Final thought from you, Jay?
You know, yesterday when I flew in, I met a woman at the airport, and she saw me wearing a Divvy cap, and she came up to me and started talking to me about this. Divvy is the bike share system here in Chicago. And she said how much she really liked it. And then what became apparent in that discussion was that she lives in the suburbs, and she said, I don't really like to bike in the suburbs because it doesn't feel comfortable to me, and the roads aren't set up for it, but I like when I come into the city that I can bike in the city. I think that's making a number of comments for us that we need to be thinking about. And one of the questions you asked, Julia, that we carefully avoided was the responsibility in dealing with this. I think I will echo a point that was made in the panel actually last night about the fact that to some extent the narrow definition of a city may not be the right definition to be able to think with the types of challenges that we're talking about here today. And I think we really do need to be thinking about metropolitan areas in the round and in the whole in doing that. I know that runs, at least in a US context, at odds with a lot of our history in doing that, but I think we're going to have to find ways to be able to think about them in that way. And I think this question that you're raising will be a local, regional question to answer. I do not believe that it's going to get answered in Washington.
So let me turn to a question from David, who asks on Twitter, how do we embed safety into the design of cities, and what role does safety actually have in well-being? Actually, Michael, you touched on that a little bit, but can you expand?
That's I think Jay mentioned earlier, I mean, our cities are presently designed the way they are. You can make some changes, but we're seeing increasingly curbs being bumped out. We're seeing the parking lanes being, for lack of a better term, almost kind of indented to give more viewing area for people walking and the cyclists so that they can see. The closing of streets, the High Line in New York, we're about to open soon the Reading Viaduct, which was closed for a long period of time. That'll be an elevated park in the city of Philadelphia. An equitable bike share program that you saw there, which is not just centered in downtown, but is actually spread out throughout neighborhoods, and the first of its kind in a big city where you don't have to have a credit card to use the system, and how those systems will progress over time. So I'm tremendously optimistic about cities and about the future of cities. This is about leadership, ultimately. It's about planning, it's about design, and that is one of the great aspects of being a mayor, that the tools are at your disposal. You can lay out a vision, paint a picture of what the future can be, provide some leadership, communicate on a regular basis, be transparent, and you can actually get some stuff done. And that's one of the beauties of this particular job.
Do you want to add to that?
Just a slightly different view of safety, very, very much front of mind for me. On January 20th this year, we had an individual with mental illness and also a drug problem who used his vehicle as a weapon. And I watched it unfold, which was just awful, because I was up on Town Hall doing a press conference at the time. He killed 6 people, including a baby. And one of the things I'm grappling with now, I don't want to turn it into Fortress Melbourne, but we do need to think about keeping people safe as they move through the streets. Our problem is whether it's knives or vehicles or bombs or guns, we can't guarantee that we can protect people's safety. But one of the things that's keeping me awake is saying, well, just how far do I go? What do I do that gives people a sense that we are thinking about these things and doing our best, but not giving a false sense of security? And it's probably uppermost in my mind at the moment.
So here's another question from social media, and I think this goes to a particularly American phenomenon. I think many people still love their cars, and actually a new car frequently actually is sort of it becomes part of somebody's identity. So the fact is that even in many cities where people still believe that the cars make their lives easier, What can we do to change that mindset? How can we lay the groundwork for a different kind of city where that's not so valued?
Can I just, I'll start the conversation and pass it off. What we're talking about here is freedom. The freedom to move in as many ways as you wish. That's what we're talking about. So creating more options in cities is about offering people that freedom, and I would encourage policymakers and politicians to be using that positive language rather than a punitive language.
I think some of this is a generational issue, though, as well. You know, the younger people in Philadelphia, you know, they're utilizing, again, I'm not here to give advertisements, but, you know, there are these apps that you can put on your phone and then you
And
pick
what?
up and
Oh, okay.
a car will come.
Oh, okay. Yes.
So
I was very worried about the direction of that conversation, Michael.
What did you say, Robert?
No, I was very worried about the direction of that conversation.
So, you know, I think a lot of younger people are like, I don't need a car. We've had population growth in Philadelphia during all 8 years of my tenure, and the first time in 60 years. That came from millennials, immigrants, and empty nesters. Our empty nesters moved out of the suburbs because they were spending so much time in Philadelphia, got rid of their car, got an apartment or a condo, and now get around the city in a very different way, or take public transportation, or ride one of our bikes. And so I think there is a generational change going on. I now started driving after 8 years of being out of a vehicle, but you know, I also take one of those services from time to time as well. I don't need a car today the way I did 20, 30 years ago.
By the way, I think the auto manufacturers are seeing this as well. We are opening up a new bike share system in the San Francisco Bay Area in just a couple weeks. And the sponsor of that bike share program is the Ford Motor Company. And what was interesting about that was that last September we stood up on a big stage in front of San Francisco City Hall. Ed Lee, the mayor of San Francisco, the Ford CEO, myself, and the CEO of Ford stood up, and his comment was Ford was not doing this to find a place to put its name. Ford was doing it to make a statement about the future of urban mobility and its place in the future of urban mobility. That is something that you would not have imagined coming out of the mouth of the CEO of one of the most renowned car companies in the world. And I think that you know, it is generational to some extent. It is about convenience and accessibility to be able to do it. And it's also, I think it will be good business as well. And those forces, I think, will all come together.
So lightning round to end here. What is one thing that makes you optimistic about the future livability of cities? Let me start with you, Robert.
There isn't one thing. There's just lots. I mean, the one thing I would say is it's wonderful when you can have a big dramatic swoop and do something that's large and, you know, city changing. It's also extremely rare. So you've got to kind of have a stamina to know that it's that incrementalism of doing little things. You know, turning the asphalt to green, making it easy to use the bike share, building the bike lanes, teaching people about sharing the streets, thinking about the building codes. You know, all of that together, as long as you feel you're moving forward, then don't get disheartened by the fact that it is incrementalism. Celebrate the point that you're making progress. That would be my comment.
Charles.
Taking off from what you're saying, Lord Mayor, I think the culture of experimentalism is really exciting, and it's being taken to higher levels by people like the mayor of Seoul, Korea, who is the social innovation mayor and is pursuing all kinds of mobility, public space, and social experiments, right down to housing for young people so they no longer have to commute for 2 hours a day, and so they can live together in a supportive environment. So it's those kinds of experiments that inspire us.
Incrementalism, experimentation, what do you say?
You know, cities are they really are the incubators of innovation all around the world. And so I would talk about initiate, innovate, and activate. The leadership being provided, and this is not just a U.S. thing because our politics worldwide are, you know, sometimes turning upside down. You are going to continue to see the rise of cities all around the world, and the leading voices will be mayors because they have a day-to-day responsibility to get stuff done. There's an expectation by the public, sometimes unreasonable, that everything will work and the mayor can fix it all. Now, that is unreasonable, but there are things that happen in cities that basically don't take place anywhere else, and that's going to be the center of innovation around the world.
Fernando.
Diversity. Diversity coming to cities is the single most important factor that makes me optimistic about the future. I know the transition is not going to be easy, especially for some places, but the single most important barrier to live together and to tolerate each other is not to know the other part. And diversity is a driving force in cities to increase quality of life and to make the world better.
Why are you optimistic?
Impact. The reality is that the changes that we're seeing in cities are having impact, and that's giving us the confidence to keep doing it. And that will spur more innovation. It will give us the ability to be able to make more and more change, and the willingness to devote resources to doing the things that really will make a difference.
I feel good about the future of cities and livability. I hope you do. Please join me in thanking this terrific panel for the conversation.